Hello, I'm Jim Falk. According to Freedom House, global freedom has been declining for the last 17 years. We're seeing rising attacks on democratic institutions and civil liberties in countries that were once considered established democracies. George Orwell said, "We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it." But why do some who gain power use it for good, and some for their own personal means at the expense of the very people they govern? We're fortunate today to welcome Moíses Naím, who is considered one of the foremost thinkers on how leaders, or in this case, dictators, authoritarians, gather and exercise power. He's currently a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's a syndicated columnist and a prolific author. His latest book is The Revenge of Power: How Autocrats Are Reinventing Politics for the 21st Century. So great to see you again, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me back.
So I just want to start with something perhaps a bit provocative. In this book, which you wrote about a year ago, you talked about how the United States was perhaps slipping towards authoritarian and a weakening of institutions. So are you as worried today, or are you more worried about where we are about 1 year later?
Well, we have had some good news in the past year. We have seen elections at the state and local level. We have seen renewed interest in making sure that the underpinnings of the electoral process, the voting process, the voting machines, the voting protocols are taken care of, and are. But that doesn't mean that the attacks on democracy have disappeared. There is a global attack on the checks and balances that define what a democracy is. A democracy is not just going to vote every few years. Is what happens in between the two votes, is what happens those years. And we have seen more of the same, which is a stealthy, almost not visible trend to try to undermine democracy from within. We have seen a bunch of dictators, disguised as Democrats, gaining power and then having all the trappings of a democracy, but in fact behaving in practice, in reality, behaving like the autocrats that they are.
And throughout our program today, we're going to be jumping around the globe. We're going to go to Israel and Mexico and a few other countries. But before we do that, tell us about the 3 Ps, because it really is such a good model to understand this erosion, if you will, towards authoritarian. And I think a good way to say it is the delegitimization of institutions.
Absolutely. And yes, the 3 Ps is an easy way to remember what are the strategies that these autocrats disguised as Democrats are undertaking. Populism, the P of populism, the P of polarization, and the P of post-truth. The 3 have been around us forever, right? Populism is nothing new, and polarization in politics and social life is also very common. Post-truth, we used to call it propaganda, political propaganda, and it also goes back in history. What has happened now is that these 3 Ps have been weaponized and transformed as instruments to control government, to get power and retain it and never leave it if possible. And so it's quite amazing. You mentioned that we're going to go around the world to see examples. It's quite amazing how very different leaders in very different countries, societies with different geographies, history, economics, politics, institutions, very different. And at the end, they behave in incredibly similar ways by using the 3 Ps as strategies to attain and retain power.
Before I read your book, if you'd said, is populism an ideology, I would have said, of course it is. But you suggest and argue that it's not.
I don't suggest it. I just look around and I find right-wing leaders that are populist and left-wing ones. Just imagine, you could not find two more different people than Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Donald Trump in the United States. They're completely different in their backgrounds, in their countries, in every, give me the list and I'll show you how different they are. And yet they are uncannily similar in the way they use the 3 Ps in the way they manage the media, the way they manage the political rivalries. The list that we know is quite global, and we see it from Peru to Israel and from Italy to Indonesia.
So when we talk about popular or authoritarian governments, and especially the three Ps, usually what you see in the media is right-wing, authoritarian, conservative. But give us examples of perhaps on the left side, progressive side, where you also see some of these same threats.
Just look at Latin America. Throughout Latin America, with one of two exceptions, until recently Ecuador, but now Ecuador is also under attack. But you can, in Latin America, you could have seen the examples in Peru, in examples in Chile, in Argentina, Mexico. Those are all examples of using the three Ps from the left.
So you wrote an article just a few weeks ago for the Global Observer, which I found so interesting, where you talked about the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, and then also about the President of Mexico. I can't think of two more different characters. Go ahead and take a minute or two and tell us why they, in a sense, come out of the same mold.
Both are directly attacking the independence of the judiciary. Remember that democracy means something when you have fair and free elections, when incumbents that lose elections leave, and how institutions are independent of the executive, in which the judicial legal decisions are made independently of who is in power. And we can see both in Israel, attacks in Israel and in Mexico and elsewhere around the world. You can see how they are attacking the media, how they are attacking and not respecting. They want to change the constitution. They want to change the rules of the game. And again, stealthily introducing clauses and ways of working and rules and laws that, in essence, are presented as good for the people. Thus, the populists appeal, but in fact are just tricks to retain power.
So in Mexico, in Israel too, I mean, there were wide protests, probably the largest protest ever in Israel, and so they were able to push back. So that was a good thing.
That was an excellent thing, and we have seen it around the world. We have seen it in France. We have seen protests in Italy, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Chile, again in Peru, Colombia, in Asia, in many Asian countries.
So when you're looking, let's go back to your three Ps and polarization. We're a year and a half or so away from the presidential election, and I can't believe they're already talking about it as much as they are, but nevertheless. So people say our country has never been more polarized. You can argue against that, but it does seem different now. Would you agree, and what do we do about it?
I agree, and I agree that we have a long history of proclaiming some things to be new and without precedent and all that, and permanent. And it turns out that they are not permanent. They do have precedent, and they are not as impactful as we feared. But I do believe that this time is different. I do believe that now we are facing an attack on democracy that is global in nature, stealthy, hard to detect. And very, very damaging to the workings of society. And we were talking about polarization, and what now happens to polarization, which has always existed, but now polarization has now melded with the identity, the politics of identity. What defines you is not your religion, is not your political party, is one of the many identities that are floating around. And that becomes the paramount force that defines how you think, how you act, and how you compete in an electoral process. And then the final force that is changing polarization is, of course, technology, the social media. Every day we get more information about research that shows that social media is influencing our behavior in ways that are not healthy from a mental health point of view, but also from a political point of view.
So you have a weekly column, and I enjoy so much reading it. And I guess it was written in early May about AI. And you wrote
Yeah.
this, or the title was "This Time It's Different." And when you mentioned just a second ago social media, well, it sure does seem like artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, et cetera, whether it's 3 or 4.0, is really going to change or give, I guess we could look at it, give these leaders that tend to be authoritarian a lot more flexibility and tools to go forth.
Exactly. That's a very accurate description. And the bottom line is that we don't know yet. We know that new technologies are very often double-edged swords, that they are good, but at the same time terrible. Think about nuclear power. There is a lot of good that can be done with the nuclear power, but at the same time, that is a technology that can destroy civilization as we know it. Uh, I believe that with artificial intelligence, we're there. We're in a technology that will change the world. In many ways, it's going to be very welcome in health and education and in other ways. But at the same time and simultaneously, it can be wreaking a havoc in our social norms, in our behaviors, in politics, and the way we conduct democracy.
So let me put you on the spot. What do we do about it? Do you think there should be more regulation of it at the federal level? And I don't see how that works when you're in the international realm.
And you know that we have had a long history of discoveries, new technologies, new methods, new practices that are considered too negative, and they're trying. And governments have tried to contain them, to hide them, to put them back in the box and not let them work. That has not worked well. Once technology exists, once scientific conclusions and results are there, very hard to hide them, to stop them, to contain them. They are out there. And so we better learn quickly how to leave and take the best out of artificial intelligence. It has a lot to contribute, but is also a great threat to civilization as we know it, I think.
Well, I want to continue that conversation perhaps in another program. So, in Turkey, over the last few weeks, we certainly saw an interesting election with President Erdogan, and it went to a runoff. And he certainly was able to, I think, do a tremendous job of using many of the tools that you talk about in your book to strengthen his position.
Turkey is a fantastic one, but again, it's a good example of how common these tactics are done. In the past, you controlled the media by controlling what happened in the newsroom. You had people, censors, sitting down and deciding, representing the government, deciding what gets disseminated and it's in the news and what is hidden, and nobody learns about that. That is the historical way of doing it. And you do it with the police and the control and the censors. Now you do it with lawyers. You do it with investment bankers. You do it in essence buying properties, buying media properties. And these are independent in theory. These are independent, but in fact they are just appendixes of the government, and they follow and they toe the line that the government dictates. And we have seen this in Hungary. Surely, we have seen it in Turkey, with the addition of factors. We saw it in Mexico, of course, with the addition of factors that journalists are no longer just contained in their world or limited in what they do, but very often they are killed, they're assassinated, they're sent to jail.
So, as someone who lives in a democracy, whether it's Mexico, which is feeling the pressure, or like you said, Hungary, what is the average citizen supposed to do? And let's take it back to here we are in Dallas, Texas. What should we be concerned about when you look at the media?
Engage. Be informed. Don't be so gullible. One of the great surprises is how gullible people are in the debates we have seen, even in very advanced, sophisticated societies. like
So
the
you,
United States. We have seen people believing the most incredible, impossible, obvious conspiracy theories that are just that, they're just conspiracies, and people are gullible. And so let's start by making people better informed and more reliably informed. And let's hope that then from there consequences exist that make the functioning of democracy. We need to lubricate and use processes that ensure and fortify the trappings and the functioning of democracy.
oh, those are good points, and it's certainly what we all would want. But how do we go about doing it? Media literacy, better education about sources.
In my book that you kindly mentioned, The Revenge of Power, there's a whole chapter about the politically homeless. There is millions of people that are homeless politically, that don't have a political home and a political house, that they don't like what they see, the bipolar system is not delivering what they want. And they eventually go to vote, very often not because they like what they're voting for, but just to block the ascendancy or the winning of the other part. So it's very important to create a situation where the homeless, the politically homeless, the people that want to be in politics but are repelled by what they see in the current political parties, that don't provide what they want, what they need, what they hope.
So let's jump to the conclusion of your book, and then I'll come back on some other questions, because you do talk about, in the last chapter, I think the title is 5 Battles We Need to Win. What are those 5 battles?
The first one is to make it most costlier to be found out as a liar. Normalizing liars, and tolerating them and allowing them to continue to lie. The left and the right, it's something we need to fight for. And I think we will have technologies that allow us to detect in better ways who is lying and who is manipulating and distorting the truth. So the first one, let's take lying seriously and make sure that those caught lying have more. Now they don't pay any consequences. There's no consequences to be identified and denounced in the media as a liar with verifiable, very kind of data and fact checking. Now it doesn't happen, so it should start happening, that we are more demanding and less gullible about the truth. The other is a global trend that I am detecting around everywhere, is the battle against criminalized governments. It used to be that the criminal organizations were outside government, but in many places in the world now, organized crime is in government. The government is a criminal entity. And that is becoming far more common than one thinks. Then there is a whole, these autocrats that are now ruling much of the world are exporting their ways of doing things, and they're developing alliances amongst them. So there is an alliance, there is a commonality, there is a way of coordinating. And we have seen incredible ways of coordinating. Countries that in the past did not have any relationship now are perfectly aligned and working together. I'm thinking about Turkey with Venezuela, with other places in the world, not to mention China.
And let me interject here. Isn't that one of the reasons why it's so hard for sanctions to be effective, say in
Absolutely.
Russia now?
Yes, that's an excellent point. Sanctions will only work if they are multilateral, more than one country actively engaged in ensuring and enforcing. And that we have had a better performance of sanctions concerning Ukraine, but we are still far from having a universal embargo system, blocking these things. The other war that we need to win is the battle against political cartels that stifle competition. We fight against concentration of power in the business sector, in the economy, but we tolerate it in politics. The concentration of power, the concentration of political cartels, of alliances that make it very hard for a third party, for example, to emerge and be a valid contestant and having a hope of becoming a force in politics. And the fifth is the battle against illiberal narratives. Is the idea of presenting how these autocrats, in fact, are delivering for the people, which is not the case. But there's an illiberal narrative that is becoming very common and often used.
Give us a good example of that.
Well, again, let's go to Hungary. The president of Hungary declared himself an illiberal and said that his job in power and was to promote and expand and internationalize the content and the rules of illiberal democracies, which means what I was just talking about, the undermining of democracy from within.
So you've touched on this, but I'd like you to go a little bit deeper, because I think all Americans, or most Americans, are concerned. We have a question from our audience. What must we do as citizens to combat polarization in the United States?
It's very interesting how one can have conversations about democracy and all these things without ever mentioning political parties. Political parties are in disrepute. Nobody likes them, or very few people like them. They have become the home of the opportunist, of the careerist. But if you have a young person or just an individual that is an idealist, that person will not find a home in current political parties, which are often corrupt, slow, unwelcoming, unattractive. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are far more successful in attracting and retaining idealists. So we need to rebuild trust in political parties, perhaps create a third political party, but that's a tall order, has failed in the United States every time it has been tried. But then perhaps there is opportunity to work from within the political parties. But there is not such a thing as a democracy of non-governmental organizations, of NGOs. Democracy has to be and has to rely on political parties that provide functions that are indispensable for a nation, which is preparing people that know about agricultural policy or about nuclear policy, that know what to do with incarceration and law enforcement. All those things is a profession that has now been abandoned and replaced by identity politics, unfortunately.
And, fortunately, we're not seeing this in the United States at this point, but how various leaders around the world, whether it be in Ecuador or in Tunisia, where the president can just say, for a variety of reasons, use what I think you would say pseudo law to shut down the National Assembly or the Congress.
Exactly. And that's one of the first things they do. They try to control the judicial system and make sure that it is rigged and protective of the incumbents.
So one of the things that I really enjoyed in your book, because there are just so many examples of it, and people say that Abraham Lincoln, with his squeaky voice, would not be elected president now. And so you really are beginning to see this concept, I think you talked about, fandom, the entertainers. And there's so many examples. Of course, Donald Trump certainly had an advantage because of The Apprentice. The former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Khan, a cricket player. How does that play into it? And how do we get beyond the celebrity culture that seems to be the dominant way for someone to become a leader?
So this is closely related to identity politics, where your identity is associated with a political leader or a sports club or a singer, where you care more, you follow, you're not just a follower. That's the word fan came out. Fandom is a very strongly felt sentiment of attachment to a political leader or to. You mentioned a few examples of broadcasters that ended up being prime ministers. In Italy, Silvio Berlusconi for many years created a system, and he was also coming from the world of the media. In Thailand also, so the route to the to power these days, it goes through the media very often.
And that gets back, I think, to one of the questions we have from our audience. How do you teach youth to recognize what's going on, whether it's polarization or post-truth, and teach them to ask the right questions?
First, by realizing that this is a problem, that this is sounds easy, but it's not easy. Trying to, the youth are idealistic. The youth are green in the sense that they know that we are having major issues with pollution and all of the environmental conversation about climate change and everything else. Give them reasons to get engaged. Provide them with explanations of why this is the most important job for humanity these days.
Well,
and that they can be part of that.
I was just sorry to interrupt you. We have covered a lot, and I think the main thing you're telling us is we need to be vigilant. Thanks as always. It's wonderful to see you. And in his iconic novel, 1984, published in 1949, George Orwell again wrote, "Power is not a means, it's an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship." As Dr. Naím reminded us, if we're not paying attention, the liberties that all of us take for granted can be slowly and deliberately diluted. Sometimes it's too late to turn back the clock. Democracy is not stagnant. It's constantly changing and evolving, which makes it imperative that we as citizens remain engaged. Thank you so much for watching today's program, where we continue to talk about things that matter with people who care. I'll see you next time.